Welcome to the Princeton Airport information meeting with Wesley. My name is Gabrielle, and thank you everyone for joining us. A few things that we're going to do today. I'm going to hand it over to Wesley, and I will mute everybody. So if you do have questions, you have the option. You can write them in the chat over here. I'll write in it. Questions. And then Wesley will go through them after each topic. I believe we're going over a detailed pre-flight and then traffic pattern. But any questions that you have there, we can go over as well. And then at the end, we're going to open it up just to general questions that you have. That's it. Does anyone have questions before we begin? No. Cool. It's nice to see all your faces because I've seen your names before. And Vol, nice to meet you. All right. I'm going to hand it over to Wesley here and mute.
All right, cool.
Buddy, wait, hold on. I got to unmute you. All right, unmute yourself, Wesley, and then you're good to go. Okay.
All right, how about now? Can you guys hear me?
You're good.
Cool. All right, yeah, so it's great to see everybody here on this Zoom meeting. I see a couple of my students here, right? We got Sarah Hill. Let's see, who else do I see? Brian, a couple other people. All right, so I think as Gab mentioned, right, we're going to kind of split this up into two different lessons, right? So we've got the detailed pre-flight first on the 172R model, and then we'll stop there, do some questions, and then we'll hop over to talking about the traffic pattern, really. So the first thing we'll do is get started with the 172R pre-flight. So just give me a moment to share my screen here. Alright, so let me just get this into the presenter mode. So can everybody see the slides open here on my screen? Alright, so I'm getting some thumbs up, should be good there. Let's get this full screen. So yeah, we're just going to go over these slides in detail, just mainly pictures going over the pre-flight done. I'll kind of talk on top of that. So before I really jump into everything here, I just want to ask this to everybody here. Are you guys aware of this pre-flight diagram on the Flying School website? I'm not sure about some students. Some know about this, some don't, but it's a pretty cool resource that I think you guys should know about. So let me just actually click this here, and we can take a look together at what we have. So basically, if you hop over to the Princeton Flying School website and click Student Resources tab over here, there's a section for the pre-flight diagram, and you can see it kind of just follows exactly what the POH has here in different sections, right? So for example, if you click the tail over here, this little dot, it'll open up to a new page, and you've got, again, different sections of stuff you got to check, right? So if I can, let me see here. So I'm hovering over this little dot, got pictures, and we also have text on the bottom, so like additional explanation on stuff you should be checking for in the pre-flight. And again, this does follow the 172R POH, so again, pretty useful resources that you guys should know about and hopefully have used in the past to learn the pre-flight. So just wanted to throw that out there in case you guys didn't know about that yet. So moving on from that. So the kind of checklist we're going to follow for the pre-flight today is going to come directly from the Cessna 172R POH, or the information manual. So I know a lot of the flying school aircraft do have the checkmate checklist inside, right? So just because this is kind of a recorded event, we are going to follow that 172R POH as we should be. We do know that the checkmate's kind of just like a third-party commercially produced checklist, but it pretty much mirrors the POH as well. So something else I do want to clarify before we move on, I'm not sure if some people are familiar with this, the term information manual versus POH, right? So if you did enroll in the ground school package for the flight school, you probably got one of those Cessna 172 pilot information manuals. Kind of looks like this on the left side over here. So those are specific to the 172R, but they're not specific to a particular plane, right? So when you actually go do your pre-flight and everything, what you're checking for in there is your pilot's operating handbook, your POH, right? That is specific to your particular plane, right? So even though it's 172R, it's specific to that certain airplane because it does contain airplane unique information that we'll talk about. So for example, you can't take out the POH for 8 Mike Charlie and switch it into 493 Romeo Mike, even though they're both 172R models there. All right, so the different sections I've got laid out for the slides, again, mirror the POH or the checklist found in section 4 normal procedures. So if you guys have that open, you can kind of follow along here, right? So the first thing is the cabin, right? So before we start walking around outside, there are things you do want to check inside your cabin before you do so, right? So as you're walking to the plane here, the first item on the checklist is your pitot tube cover, right? Right now, I don't believe the flight school has pitot tube covers on the aircraft, but again, just as a rule, want to make sure there's no tennis ball or a pitot tube cover on that pitot tube beforehand. And you also, as we will do later on, check for blockage, right? So when we check the pitot tube itself, there's going to be two different holes we're looking for, right? So the pitot tube on top over here, and if you guys take a look right behind the pitot tube on the back, there's this little drain hole that you also want to make sure that's unobstructed and there's no blockage there as well. So the second item now is going to be your pilot's operating handbook, right? So with this, we're just going to group together the AERO acronym if you guys are familiar with that, right? So the POH, want to make sure that's present in your aircraft there. And if we do open this up, you do want to definitely check that first page and verify that this is the proper serial number and registration, right? So we saw earlier, this is the POH for Mike Charlie. We just opened that up. You want to make sure it says November 2908 Mike Charlie in there as well. The next thing we can look for is the airplane weight and balance. So this is the W in your AERO acronym, right? Some students get confused sometimes, the weight and balance doesn't mean that you're actually doing your weight and balance bringing it to the airplane. So you should be doing that, but we actually want to be checking the back of this POH here for your weight and balance information that is specific to the airplane, right? So for example, in the flight school aircraft, there's this little section in the back called aircraft papers, and if you open that up, you can see this is the weight and balance data for November 2908 Mike Charlie in there. So in addition, we covered the O and W in AERO, right? So the first two are the airworthiness and registration that you also want to be looking for. So we can see these two documents for our flight school aircraft on the left side towards the bottom of your pilot seat over here. So if we go into more detail, we've got your registration and your airworthiness certificate. So for the registration, this is going to expire every 3 years, so you can actually check the date right on the bottom over here, just verify that's still valid and it's the proper N number. And with your airworthiness certificate, right, this is not going to have an expiration. You just do want to make sure, though, that it has the proper N number for your aircraft that you're flying, right? The next item in the cabin is checking for your parking brake, right? So the 172 RPO, which does call for the parking brake to be set during the pre-flight, so that's going to look basically like it's aiming straight down towards the floor, right? I believe some of the aircraft at flight school do have parking brakes operating, some don't, so if you don't have one, no big deal there. Next is definitely an important one, right, if you actually do want to be doing this proper pre-flight inspection on the outside. So that control wheel lock, which hopefully is in place from the previous lesson or renter, do you want to make sure you're taking that out and placing it in the compartment in the side over here, so that it's going to allow you to basically be able to check your flight control surfaces when you are doing that exterior inspection. Next, you want to make sure your ignition switch is off and that your avionics master switch is off. The next thing we're going to do is get that master switch on. We're just going to check a couple of things here, right? Don't want to leave this on for too long. So the first thing we can look for are your fuel quantity indicators right over here. So the top left of these four are your fuel quantity indicators, and you just want to make sure that it's indicating some amount of fuel. And if you check your annunciator panel on top over here, you do want to make sure the low fuel annunciator light has been extinguished, right? If that's there, there's a good chance, if you low fuel there. So we will talk about this later, that these gauges are not entirely accurate, so we do want to be visually inspecting your fuel amount when we're doing your exterior inspection. The next thing we can do is cycle your avionics master switch to see if you can hear your cooling fan, right? So what happens is when you turn your avionics master on, you should be able to hear a little cooling fan, sometimes a little quiet. I think it's 172 Fox Whiskey. It's just a little harder to hear, but basically once you get that avionics master on, you should hear a cooling fan. As long as you hear that, then you can just turn that right back off. The next thing on our checklist is to verify your static pressure alternate source valve is fully pushed in. Though the POH checklist doesn't call for it to be tested, but I believe the checkmate checklist that we have in the airplane itself do call for those to be tested. So what you can actually do, this little red valve, if you pull that out, you can see a little flicker on your vertical speed indicator. That just means your static pressure is coming from inside the cockpit rather than your external static port now. And we can also do an enunciator panel test over here, right? So this little switch next to your enunciator panel, you can just flip that to test and hold it there for a couple seconds. All of your enunciator lights will remain on, and when you release it, they will come off except for oil pressure and vacuum over there. Alright, so now we can come towards the floor over here. We can make sure your fuel selector is on both and your fuel shutoff valve is fully in there. And then you want to come over to your flaps lever over here. You want to extend your flaps all the way down to 30 degrees so that we can check them during your exterior pre-flight inspection. So the POH is also going to call for you to check your pitot heat, right? So it doesn't specify if it's VFR or IFR, it just says we have to do a pitot heat test, right? So what you can do, sorry about that. What you can do is turn your pitot heat on, wait for 30 seconds, and you just want to check outside that the pitot tube is warm to touch. And if it is, pitot tube is functioning properly, and you can turn that pitot heat back off over there. And after all that's done, you can now turn your master switch off. And we can also set your elevator trim while we're at it, right? So that getting toward the end of your cabin checklist. So something I do want to note about setting your elevator trim for takeoff. So I know a lot of the aircraft are going to have this little marking in the middle for takeoff trim, but most of the time that's actually not too accurate, right? So what you can do if you pull your yoke all the way back and look behind you, just kind of play around with that trim control wheel until your trim tab is level with your elevator, and that should give you a pretty good sense of that takeoff trim, and maybe a little bit of adjustments afterwards, but that's kind of the preferred method there rather than just looking at that takeoff trim detent over there. So next, just want to make sure that baggage door outside is closed and locked, and that kind of wraps up the first section there for the cabin. And now we'll talk about doing that exterior inspection around the aircraft, right? So with section 2 here, the first thing on the checklist is going to be a rudder gust lock, right? None of the aircraft here at the flight school, at least the 172s, we don't have any rudder gust locks installed. But if you do, or if you're flying 172R, you see one of these, definitely want to make sure that it is removed and disconnected. Additionally, the tail tie down, right? Silly that it's in the checklist, but again, something important, right? I've seen sometimes we're trying to taxi, still tie down's on, no good, right? So just want to make sure that you check that your tail tie down is removed. So in this case, your tail tie down hook is right on the back over there, and we do not see anything. So here now we're going to do our control surface check, right? So we'll start off with our elevators. So the elevators here, we're just going to kind of move it from this side. I'll play this video. Kind of silly video of me of just moving the elevator up and down from this side, and we're just basically checking for freedom of movement and security there. So what we can also look for that security portion is checking all your different elevator hinges. Just make sure there's no damage, any cracks or anything like that. And then when we lift up your elevator, we can take a look here at your lower left bulkhead, and there's a couple of things I want to point out. So I've circled 3 spots over here. All of these are called stop bolts, right? So these 2 on the bottom are for your rudder. So what's going on is as you move that rudder left and right, this hinge is going to press against these bolts to prevent excess range of motion. And same deal with this stop bolt on top, except that's your down stop for the elevator. So again, just want to make sure all those are present, and if not, that's an indication that your control surfaces may again have an excess range of motion, so you won't want to fly that there. Let's go back to that slide for a second. In addition to this, I just want to mention, do check your rudder control cables, elevator control cables, again, for any damage. And you can see that we have the safety pin inserted to the castle nut here for your rudder control cable. So now we can talk about the rudder over here, right? So pretty similar check. Just want to make sure there's no cracks or damage in your hinges there. And then we can move that left and right, as you can see here. And when you move that rudder left and right, you are going to feel just a little bit more resistance compared to when you move that elevator up and down. That's a good thing. If it feels a little bit loose, that could be a sign that one of your control cables is a little bit loose and you want to get that taken a look at. Alright, so now we're going to come to the right side here. Again, same deal, we're checking your elevator. I'm not going to play the video, but again, that's just me coming from the side, moving up and down, checking for freedom of movement. And we can also check the conditions of the bulkhead over here. So you've got your control cable for the rudder on the right side. We saw your stop bolts earlier. And now we can come to your trim tab, right? So we talked about adjusting your trim tab for the takeoff position earlier in the cockpit. But what we're going to do now on the exterior, we're not going to move the trim tab itself. You just want to look to make sure there's no cracks in any of these hinges over here, right? So another thing I do want to emphasize, when we are checking the elevator for movement, you do not want to be holding it from the trim tab, right? So all you should be doing, just making sure we're checking for any damage on your hinges there. And finally, for checking for security with your elevator, we talked about all of your hinges here, right? So I know it's a little bit hard to see, but on this picture on the left side, there is, again, a safety pin inserted to the castle nut that's helping to make sure your trim tab will stay attached there, so you just want to verify that's present. And the last item for section 2 here is going to be antennas, right? So on your tail here, we've got these two antennas on top. These are your VOR whiskers here. Just want to make sure, again, we're checking for security of attachment and general condition. And I also found this other diagram online that, again, good overview of your antennas if you're not too fresh on that. So you've got your ELTs, your comms over here, and right on top is for your GPS over there. All right, so moving on to section 3, we've got the right wing trailing edge. So for here, we're just going to be checking our two control surfaces that we have, and we're going to start off with your aileron. And same deal, just looking for freedom of movement and security, right? So your aileron's on your trailing edge, farther away from your fuselage. And what we're going to do, we're going to see if we can try to hold it from the rivet line in the middle. That's just the strongest point there. So you're going to see me grab the aileron, and again, we're just moving this up and down, checking for freedom of movement. And what you can also do if you come off to the other side behind the wing, you can look at the aileron on the left side. If you move the right side up, the other one should be going down, as we know. Additionally, we can check the security, right? So you're going to see there's going to be 3 rows of hinges here, piano hinges. So you can check to make sure all your screws are in, and there should also be this pin that goes through all the hinges. Additionally, some people do this, right? You can move the little control rod left and right there for some wiggle. But if you are going to do that, please make sure you are holding on to the aileron, especially if it is a windy day, right? We don't want to accidentally chop off our fingers or anything like that there. And now we can come to the flaps, right? So your flaps are, again, still on the trailing edge, but now closer to your fuselage. So we see, again, we've got a push rod in the middle and then 2 hinges that we're going to check for general condition as well, right? So what we can do when checking for your condition of your flaps, just again, we've got a little push rod left and right, just a little bit movement, and you can just give a little push to the flaps just to make sure it's secure there. And that's all you're checking. Alright, so we're going to move to the next slide over here. Coming to, again, section 4 of the checklist is going to be your right wing, right? So we're just going to check some other stuff. Again, first item on the checklist is your wing tie down, right? It's silly that this is on it, but it's really important, right? You just want to make sure that tie down is disconnected, and just try to see if you can put it off to the side there, right? Don't want to leave all the rope hanging around everywhere just so that no one else taxiing around will suck that into the propeller or anything there. And the second thing is your main wheel tire, right? So I see a lot of times students aren't really too sure what to check for the tire here, so we'll just go over a couple items. So when you take a look at the tire right here from the side, you do want to make sure your cotter pin is inserted to the wheel nut for the first thing. And then when you take a look at top, a couple things you can look for, right? So you've got tire tread, tire inflation, right? Just give that a little kick, make sure you have proper tire inflation. And we can even take a closer look over here at the condition of your 2 brake pads and then thickness of the brake disc over here as well. And finally, you do just want to make sure that since these are hydraulically actuated brakes, there's no red hydraulic fluid leaking around anywhere as well. So, all right, another important thing here, fuel tank sump, quick drain valves, checking your fuel beforehand, right? So this is just going to follow what we have in our flight school aircraft. Each of them should have this little baggie that contains one of your drainers. So we're just going to take that out, and you're going to have 5 of these sumps under each wing, 3 under those that we'll talk about. So please make sure you are checking each of these, so all 5 under each wing and the 3. And what you want to do after you collect that fuel, just kind of hold it up to a white surface, right? And just verify that it's blue. You don't see any water or anything like that. So just to make sure we all know, water is going to be heavier than our aviation gas here, so it's going to sink to the bottom and you'll see a layer form. You also do want to visually check that fuel quantity. So just like we mentioned earlier, right, the fuel quantity indicators in the aircraft are not entirely accurate. So we do have that little fuel stick in our bag, so we can hop up onto the wing and just verify by opening up the cap. We can stick that into the tank to see how much fuel we have. I also have a video here of me using this fuel stick. I see a lot of people don't know how to actually use this, so just to make sure we're pretty good at this, I'm just going to play this here. So I'm just putting my thumb on top into the tank, releasing my thumb, thumb is back on, coming nice and tight, and then after that, if we take it out, we can see your fuel level is right there on that line. Alright, so next, again, seems kind of silly that this is on the checklist, but very important as well. After you are checking your fuel, please make sure that you do tighten that fuel filler cap back on, and that it is unobstructed, right, because these are vented, which we will talk about later as well. Alright, so section 5 now, we're going to come to the nose. So a couple of different things that we can check over here. So just like I mentioned earlier, there's going to be 3 of those sumps on the bottom of the nose, and we should be able to drain those as well. So the one closest to your nose gear over here is going to be for your fuel strainer, and these 2 are your reservoir and selector sumps. So again, just want to make sure you are draining the fuel and checking that there's no contaminants or any water or anything like that in there. Next, another important thing, right, you want to check your oil. So just in case no one knows how to check the oil, yeah, I'll play this little video here, right? So we're just going to pop that little hood open. There's your oil dipstick. Just unscrew that. Again, if it's a little tight, there should be a pair of pliers in the bag. So we're going to just take it out until we can basically see the oil level. So we're just rotating around trying to find the numbers. I know it's a little blurry on the video, but we're just checking to make sure that it complies with manufacturer recommendations, right? So as per the POH, right, we're not going to operate with less than 5 quarts, and I think it says for extended flight you want to fill it to 8 quarts, right? So after we check that, we're just going to make sure we place that dipstick back in, screw that cap back on, and again, it doesn't have to be super tight, just nice and secure there. Alright. So next we're going to check your engine cooling air inlets. So another thing we can do in addition to that is your alternator belt. You can just give that a little tug, just make sure it's secure. So I'm just kind of hovering my mouse around that, so you can check your alternator belt and just taking a look inside the air inlets, make sure there's no birds or anybody else hanging out in there. And we can also check your propeller and spinner, right? So with this, you're just running your hand along the edge of the blades, feeling for any dents or significant cracks there, and just making sure all of your screws in your propeller, hover, and spinner are intact and present as well. We also do want to check your air filter over here, right? So all that air is going to be mixed with the fuel is going to enter through this air filter. So you do want to make sure that it's clear of contaminants, right? Sometimes you may see a couple bugs or bees blocking, so I just want to move those out of the way there. And then we can come to your nose wheel or strut and the tire, right? So just like we talked about before the tire, you can check for proper tire tread and inflation. And with your strut, a good rule is to have 4 fingers width for your strut here. So obviously this one looks pretty good. And then the exhaust is actually not on the 172 RPOH checklist here, but I'm just including it as I believe it is on the Preflight Diagram on the Flying School website. So what you can do, you can take your checklist or a cup and just kind of tap the exhaust. It should be a clean ting sound, and if there's not, it could mean that there's a crack somewhere in there, so you wouldn't want to fly there. And then finally, the last item for section 5 of the nose is to check your static port opening on the left forward side of your fuselage, right? So for this, I recommend just kind of visually inspecting it to make sure this little hole is clear. I have seen people run their fingers over it. I'm going to actually recommend against doing that, just in case you have any oils or anything like that on your hand that could obstruct that opening. Alright, so now we're coming over to the left wing, and for the most part, it's kind of the same stuff that we were talking about on the right wing that we're going to check out, right? So for some of this, I'm just going to go relatively quickly since it's the same stuff. So, of course, fuel quantity, we want to be visually inspecting that as well. We want to make sure your fuel filler cap is nice and secure and that your vent is unobstructed. And of course, we have 5 drain valves under the left wing as well that you want to be checking for any contaminants or any water or anything like that. then same deal with your main wheel tire on this side. Alright, so just to quickly go over those things we were talking about, want to make sure the cotter pin's inserted to the wheel nut. You're looking for tire tread, tire inflation, conditions of your brake disc, brake pads, and you also want to make sure there's no hydraulic fluid leaking around anywhere there. So if we now come to the left wing leading edge, right, just a couple of different things here. So you're going to see on the left wing of the 172 here, there's just little check valves, your fuel tank vent opening. So the reason why we only have it on the left side, there's actually an interconnecting line that connects the right and left tank, so that just allows us to have one vent on the left wing. And additionally, as I mentioned earlier, both of your fuel filler caps are vented, right? So again, just want to make sure that these aren't blocked over there. And don't be alarmed again if there's just a little fuel dripping out, especially when it's a little hotter out there. Additionally, you do want to check that your stall warning opening is unobstructed as well there. And then, of course, the wing tied down, just want to make sure that's disconnected and thrown off to the side. And you also do want to, again, just check the cleanliness of the covers of your taxi and landing lights over there as well. And now finally we'll just come to the left wing trailing edge, and it's the same deal as what we checked on the right wing, right? So you've got your ailerons and your flaps again. So with the ailerons, right, we were checking for freedom of movement and security through your hinges. And with your flaps, same deal, right? You got your two hinges on the side and that little push rod in the middle that we can wiggle to have a little bit of movement. And if we push your flaps up from the bottom, again, just a little bit of movement there as well. Alright, so that kind of just covers the basic pre-flight that is listed in the 172 RPOH there. I know there's maybe some stuff that we may have not discussed, right? For example, in the Checkmate checklist there, I think they also ask you to do a light test. Again, always a good idea too, right? But we're just following directly from the 172 RPOH checklist there. So that covers the pre-flight there. So if you guys want to start throwing in those questions in the chat, and we'll see if we can start answering that before we move on to the next section, which is the traffic pattern. Alright, so I got one question here from Anita that I'm going to read out loud. So Anita asked, what do you do with the fuel after draining it? I believe these days you don't dispose on the ground. So it's a pretty good question there. It kind of depends on the jar that you're using to drain the fuel, right? So if you got one of those fancy GATS jars, you should be able to pour it back into the tank because of that filter. However, if you are using another jar that doesn't have a filter, I probably would not recommend putting that fuel back into the tank just if there is any contaminants, water, or anything like that. So in that case, I would dispose that on the ground there, if that answers your question. Alright, cool. So I got a question from Garrett here. Stall horn, do you need to use suction to test by mouth or suction device? Another good question, right? So what I'm going to do, I'm just going to read right from the POH to tell you what they say, right? So for the stall warning opening, it says check for blockage. To check the system, place a clean handkerchief over the vent opening and apply suction. A sound from the warning horn will confirm system operation. So POH there is just telling you you can use your mouth pretty much to apply suction, and it's saying place a clean handkerchief over there just because if not, you're probably going to get a lot of bugs in your mouth or something over there. Alright, so I got a question from Andrew here. If you see the fuel gauges don't match the actual, how far off is acceptable? So that's a pretty good question as well, and I don't really have kind of a set number there. So we should know that those fuel quantity indicators are pretty much only accurate when the fuel tanks are empty, right? So you really don't want to go off of those. So as long as you are visually checking the amount of fuel that you have during your pre-flight by opening up those fuel filler caps and then you use your stick to see how much, or looking at the tabs, right, which is 17.5, that's kind of what you want to go off for there, right? I wouldn't worry too much if the fuel gauges aren't exactly matching or just a little bit off there. Alright, and I got another question from Garrett here. Your opinion of using checklists from ForeFlight. I noticed some discrepancies between those and the POH. So straight up, POH is your main source for all your checklists, right? That's kind of the whole owner's manual for the airplane, pretty much. So I would go by the POH. If the checklist is a little bit different on ForeFlight, I would definitely want to verify, kind of compare it with the POH, see what is different, and kind of take into consideration if it's necessary. But that's kind of my opinion there. I would be using the POH primarily. Alright, so I'm not seeing anything else coming over there, but if there are any more questions filtering in about pre-flight, I'll definitely answer those later on. But what we'll do now, we'll kind of go into our second segment over here, which is all going to be about traffic patterns, right? So, same deal, I'm just going to share my screen with you guys and get this presenter view open. All right, cool. So traffic patterns. So before we kind of dive into all this stuff, I just want to ask this question to you guys here. So why do we have airport traffic patterns? What do you guys think? So if you want to type your answers in the chat, or I don't know if it's possible to unmute yourself. Let's see here.
Yeah, they can unmute themselves.
They can? All right, cool. Yeah. So
give us
if anyone wants to participate here, that'd be good. See if anyone knows why do we have airport traffic patterns. What do you guys think? Let me open the chat here. All right, so Andrew says prevent collision. Good answer, right? Definitely right, prevent collision. Anybody else want to chime in here? All right, no worries then. So what I'll do here, I'm just going to move over to the next slide then. So directly from the Airplane Flying Handbook, this is what we have in the quotations. I'm not going to read that out loud just because it's a lot there. But basically the whole deal with this is we should be able to depart and arrive at an airport in a standard manner to maintain a high level of safety. So pretty much, again, what Andrew said there, preventing collisions. And I see now Sarah Hill says organization and coordination, exactly. So all this stuff combining together into this traffic pattern idea, right? So we're just going to start with a couple basics here with the traffic pattern, right? So your standard direction for all traffic patterns is going to be left. So if we take a look at the sectional here, for example, for Central Jersey, right? The runway, I think it's 7 and 25, we're going to have left patterns. However, when we come to Princeton, right, we're going to see this little symbol on the bottom that says star RP. Does anybody know what that means here? Star RP. Why do we have that under Princeton? So yeah, verbal participation is cool too.
Right pattern for helicopters.
Yeah, all right, cool. So at Princeton we have right pattern for helicopters, right? So when we see that star RP, that actually doesn't necessarily mean it's right pattern for helicopters. It just means that there's some special considerations for the right pattern, and you want to check that chart supplement or AFD, whatever you guys want to call that nowadays. So exactly. So if you open up the chart supplement for Princeton, you're going to see on the airport remarks it says runway 1028 right traffic for helicopters. So that's something we want to definitely remember there, right? Your standard traffic pattern altitude is going to be 1,000 feet AGL, and again, it's not always going to be the case. We do want to refer to that chart supplement for further information. So, for example, at Trenton, right, if you check out those airport remarks, right over here, it says TPA for aircraft under 12,500 pounds. Your pattern altitude is going to be 1,200, which is 987 AGL. But aircraft over 12,500 pounds, pattern is going to be 1,700 feet MSL, so they're a little higher. It's something you're going to see pretty often there. Some other basics here that should be relatively familiar. So at a Tarrant Airport, air traffic control is going to be pretty much in charge of that flow of traffic. So you're going to receive pertinent information about entering the pattern, departing the pattern, all by radio. However, when we're flying to a non-Tarrant airport like Princeton, or going into Solberg, Skyman, or anything like that, we pilots are going to be responsible for determining all this stuff. So we have to determine the traffic pattern direction. We're responsible for complying with appropriate traffic rules and, of course, displaying common courtesy towards other pilots, right? All right, so I've kind of got this interactive slide here that we're just going to keep clicking through to draw a traffic pattern together. So this is what we're going to have at Princeton, right? We've got 28 and 10. Traffic pattern here is going to be 1,200 feet MSL. We've got left traffic, but just as Garrett said earlier, we've got right traffic for helicopters, right? And I'm also going to have a couple of target airspeeds in here that, again, just going to follow the 172R model. All right, so the first thing I want to ask, this first leg over here, let me just see if I can get the spotlight tool out. All right, so this first leg, let's say we've got left traffic for runway 28, so we're going this way. Does anybody know what this first leg is called? So again, if you want to type in the chat or say out loud, that'd be good.
Departure.
All right, I don't know who said that, but that's exactly right. That was, yeah, that's your departure leg. Awesome. So, let me just click this through here. That's exactly right. So that's your departure leg. I was hoping someone would actually say upwind, but all good. So we got departure leg. There is a lot of confusion with this first leg for some reason, but if you do, check out the AIM or you're reading the Airplane Flying Handbook, all these official FAA sources, this is your departure leg. Your upwind leg is parallel to the departure leg, but it's on the upwind side of your airport. So the upwind for 28 would be located right over here, right? One instance where you could be flying the upwind leg, right? Let's say you're on final for 28 and you have to go around for traffic departing. You may sidestep off to the right to fly upwind. But when you are straight out of that runway 28 departing straight out into the pattern, that first leg is called your departure leg. That's correct. So what we're doing now, we're just going to be climbing at 79 knots, right? That's your VY speed in the 172R. And then this first turn over here, we're going to start this turn at traffic pattern altitude minus 300 feet. So for us at Princeton, that's going to be 900 feet MSL or 700 AGL, about there. So what's this next leg over here called? Who can tell me what the next 90-degree left turn is going to be called?
Left crosswind?
Yeah, there you go. Cool. So this is your crosswind leg, right? So during this crosswind leg, we're still just climbing out at 79 knots. And what's going to happen here, this next turn is going to be done at your traffic pattern altitude. So that's kind of what Advisory Circular 9066 Bravo recommends. We start this next turn for your next leg at your traffic pattern altitude once you reach that, which is 1200 MSL. But the primary factor is going to be distance from the runway. So what is this longer leg called here? Who wants to shout that out? All right, so I'm not getting it there. But all right, someone,
Downwind.
here we go. There we go. Yeah, so I got a lot of people. Exactly. So that's downwind. Cool. So here's your downwind leg. So what we're going to do immediately on downwind, just get yourself leveled out and trimmed for 90 knots approximately. That's what we're aiming for in the 172R. And a power setting of about 1900 RPM works pretty well for that. So as you're flying along on downwind, just going parallel to that runway, and your width on downwind from the runway should be half to 1 mile directly from the Airplane Flying Handbook. We are going to talk about a couple references at Princeton to help you determine distance and all that stuff, but just keep that in mind, about half to 1 mile distance on downwind leg. And something that does help if you are flying that 172R, if you place the runway about that midpoint, about midway through your strut, that's going to give you about the proper distance there. So you're just flying along downwind, you can complete your pre-landing checks, whatever that is, maybe gumps or something else. And what's going to happen is once you are beam the numbers 28 over here on downwind, you're going to start setting up for your landing. So power is going down to 1500, you're going to start pitching for 85 knots, and you're going to get those flaps down to 10 degrees as long as you're below 110 knots, which should be the case since, again, in the pattern, no reason to be faster than 100 knots. And now, again, since we're pitched for 85 knots, you're just starting that descent. Nothing too steep, approximately 300 to 500 feet per minute there. So we're just flying along on downwind until we reach approximately 45 degrees away from your runway numbers. So this angle right there. And we're going to turn to our next leg. So who can tell me what this next leg is going to be called?
Base.
Nice. All right, got a lot of responses there. That's your base leg. Cool. So we're flying on base. So once your wings level on base, I'll say that again. Once your wings level on base, then we'll get your flaps down to 20 as long as you're below 85, and you're going to start pitching for 75 knots. And what you want to do now on base, you can kind of judge your altitude based on what you're looking at the runway and adjust as necessary, right? So we should all remember our principle is power for altitude, pitch for airspeed. All that stuff is going to apply here, right? And then finally, this last turn, this last leg, who can tell me what this is called?
Final?
Cool, yeah, that's your final. So what we're going to do is get yourself nice and line up with the runway and pitch for 65 knots, flaps down to 30 there on final. So we haven't adjusted any of these numbers for wind or anything, but this is just kind of your standard traffic pattern with target airspeeds for the 172R, right? So I think just kind of seeing this diagram is pretty helpful before you try yourself, but this is the traffic pattern here at Princeton, right? So I just want to point out a couple references for what we have to help you fly this standard traffic pattern at Princeton, right? So we're simulating that we've got left traffic here, left traffic pattern for runway 28, and so we're going to do to determine distance from that runway on downwind. There's this little neighborhood right before the ridge off to your right side, and if you fly kind of right over that, that's approximately 0.8 miles from the runway, so that's pretty good distance. Another thing to help you with, again, any wind correction on that downwind is, I'm sure some of you are probably familiar with this, there's a little group of solar panels right off your nose when you're flying on left downwind for 28. This is what they look like over here, so if you just kind of aim right toward those, that'll give you pretty good kind of correction from wind or anything and distance from that runway on downwind. So you always kind of want to be on either on the left or headed straight towards those solar panels. If you're on the right side of those solar panels, you're way too wide out for your pattern there. In terms of a point for turning base, again, hopefully some of you guys are familiar with this here. There's this little church that you can see right off the main road in Rocky Hill. It's got a pretty prominent steeple, and that's just what it's going to look like over there. Sometimes a little bit difficult to see because of the trees, But that point is good for turning base. So when you turn base, you want to kind of be aiming directly towards that church, and that's pretty good to set you up on that 45-degree angle from runway 28 there. Alright, so I also want to just briefly talk a little bit about wind correction in terms of the pattern, right? So when you think about it, the pattern is pretty much kind of like a ground reference maneuver, right? So if you guys remember doing those S-turns or turns around a point when you're working on the private, right? It's kind of the same stuff, your rectangular course, right? So when you are flying the pattern, you always want to be thinking about where that wind is coming from and adjust or maintain a proper ground track. So for example here, right, we're going to simulate the wind is straight down that runway, winds from the west, and we're favoring 28, right? So the rule is always going to be crabbing into the wind. So for example, on crosswind, the wind is going to want to blow you east, so you're going to have to correct it a little bit towards the wind there, and then it's going to be the opposite on base, for example, right? The wind is going to want to blow you away from the runway, so you would have to crab your nose a little bit to the left towards the wind there as well. I also do want to talk a little bit about radio calls in the pattern, right? So it's kind of like a general formula that we can use. So the first call, for example, if we're just staying in the pattern in 28, an example call would be Princeton traffic, Skyhawk 3 Romeo Mike departing runway 28, left closed traffic, Princeton. So that's something we can say just to communicate your intentions, right? So a lot of people also just say departing runway 28, Princeton. That's totally okay too, right? You are announcing your intentions, but I think it is definitely helpful just by adding that phrase left closed traffic or left patterns in there just to provide further information about what you're about to do there. But other than that, the rest of the calls kind of follow this formula that you see in the middle here, right? So you've got airport name, traffic, your aircraft ID, left, and then your pattern leg, the runway and runway number, and then the airport name again. So if we were doing right patterns though, we'd replace that with the right. But if I was going to give some example calls, we could say Princeton traffic, Skyhawk 2 Foxtrot Whiskey, left crosswind, runway 28 Princeton. Or Princeton traffic, Skyhawk 5-4 uniform, left downwind, runway 28 Princeton. The one kind of exclusion to this is when you're turning final, right? We're not going to just say left or right final. You can just say final or turning final for the runway there. This next slide, also something important here. I'm sure some of us has said this stuff in the past, it's alright, but we're going to try to not say this stuff anymore. So, any traffic in the area, please advise. Princeton traffic, anybody on base or final? Princeton traffic, clear of the active. So, we're just going to go through each of these. I want to see if you guys can tell me what the problem with saying each of these. So, this first one here, any traffic in the area, please advise. Why should we not be saying that one? So, if anyone wants to, again, use the chat or other kind of participation is all good. So why should we not say any traffic in the area, please advise?
Is it distracting to other pilots?
Yeah, that's true. It is distracting to other pilots. That's one for sure. The whole deal is there really is no point. If there's traffic in the area, they should already be advising. So again, 9066 Bravo is literally states this. There's no reason to say any traffic in the area, please advise. Cool. All right, what about this one here? Princeton traffic, anybody on base or final? Why is that kind of pointless? Why should we not be saying that call?
They would have already made the call by then.
Yeah, exactly. They already made the call, or you could just look out your right window and use your eyes. Good, exactly. All right, and then how about this last one here? Princeton traffic, clear of the active. So what's wrong with this call? Clear of the active.
Confusion what the active is, which runway?
Cool. Yeah. So at non-towered airports, there's no active runway. So the good thing with Princeton, there is just run runway, right? So definitely want to specify clear of 10 or 28, but if you are flying, for example, to a non-towered airport with multiple runways, say you're going to Orange County or something, right? If you say clear of the active, that's pretty useless, right? Again, because we don't have an active runway at a non-towered airport, so we want to be as specific as possible, say clear of runway 28 or whatever it is. Cool. All right. So I'm sure after you get your private certificate, you're not just going to spend all of your flying hours flying traffic patterns. So we definitely want to talk about entering and departing the pattern. So let's first talk about entering the pattern, and this is kind of where I see the most confusion with students and pilots in general. So a couple things we want to emphasize here. You must be at the traffic pattern while entering the pattern, right? So if you're entering while descending, this is going to create a lot of collision hazards. Aircraft have blind spots we can't necessarily see below or above. So when you are entering the pattern, you should be at that traffic pattern altitude already. In terms of entering the pattern itself, there are two methods. The preferred method is going to be the 45-degree entry to the downwind leg abeam the midpoint of the runway, right? So we're going to show a little diagram afterwards, but that's going to be your preferred method. So we always want to be doing that 45-degree entry. However, there is an alternate entry, which is just midfield crossing and cutting right into the downwind. We do not want to be using that when there are other aircraft in the pattern, right? If if just by yourself, okay, but when you have other guys in the pattern, you really should be using this 45-degree entry, and that's what we should be practicing at all times. So this diagram here comes directly from the Airplane Flying Handbook and Advisory Circular 9066 Bravo, right? Kind of shows you those two methods. So the preferred entry is the 45 that we were talking about. So for example, you just want to cross midfield at pattern altitude plus 500 or plus 1,000 feet. Fly clear of the traffic pattern approximately 2 miles and then start a descending turn into the 45-degree entry. So by the time you're on the 45, you should be at the pattern altitude, and then you're just checking for any traffic already on crossing or downwind, yielding to them before you enter on the downwind, right? Again, that alternate entry is just crossing midfield at the pattern altitude and going into the downwind. But again, remember our preferred method, we should be using the 45 over here. So kind of have another satellite view of what we got at Princeton coming in from the north. So let's say you were just finishing up a solo flight of the practice area, practicing some slow flights, T-turns, all that stuff, and they're using 2.8, right? So we're coming from the north. We're just going to cross again midfield, flying south, and we cross at 2,000, and the diagram before recommended to fly approximately 2 miles before you start that turn. So what happens is, if you fly pretty much with this 90-degree heading off the runway all the way south, you're going to see these two white tanks off to your right side. So that's going to be a pretty good landmark over there. So if you fly just a couple of seconds past those tanks and start that descending right turn onto the 45, you should be on a pretty good spot to join the pattern there. So that's what I would usually recommend. And you can see we're nowhere near the city of Princeton yet, right? So if you're making that turn and join the 45 over the stadium, you're like 4 miles out, so that's way too far out. So just make sure you want to kind of start that turn on the 45 somewhere around those tanks. That's approximately 1.5 to 2 miles over there. So that's entering the pattern, right? And with departing the pattern, again, there's only two methods of departing the pattern, right? And this is straight from that advisory circular that we're going to talk about. So you can either depart straight out or exit with a 45-degree left turn or right turn for right traffic pattern. And you want to do this when you are beyond the departure out of the runway and after you are above the pattern altitude. So remember, these are your only two ways to depart the pattern. If you want to do something else, you have to make sure you are clear of the pattern beforehand there. All right, so just some additional considerations I wanted to mention with the pattern here, especially for students, right? When we're turning, shouldn't be using any more than 30 degrees of bank, especially while turning base to final, right? You don't want to end up in any kind of cross-controlled stall. And something else to mention and definitely emphasize is we always want to be scanning for traffic, right? Is the traffic pattern, there's likely going to be a bunch of different aircraft there. So a couple common spots where you will see traffic. There may be someone joining on the 45, right? Let's say you're on downwind. Before you turn base, definitely check the final. See if anybody's on final before you start that turn, right? You don't want to end up cutting anyone off. And here's another big one, right? When you're on base about to turn final, not only should you be looking at the runway, you also want to be looking on the opposite side to check if there's anybody on an extended final, right? And this has kind of to do with instrument approaches. There may be someone practicing RNAV 28 into Princeton, and they're just coming on a long 10-mile final into the runway. So you definitely want to be scanning and listening for traffic in that sense. And additionally, I think I mentioned it briefly earlier, there are blind spots in high wing and low wing aircraft, right? You can't see in different spots. So that's something else you definitely want to consider before turning, for example, there. Something else definitely to mention, right-of-way rules, right? You can find more of that in 91.113. But just two quick ones to mention, right? If you've got two aircraft on final at the same time, the lower aircraft is going to have the right-of-way. And just remember that an aircraft in distress has right-of-way over all other aircraft, right? And the last consideration I also want to talk about is just to understand that other traffic in the pattern may cause you to have to alter your own pattern, right? So it may not just be a perfect, pretty little rectangle each time, right? It may have to end up doing some right 360s in the downwind for spacing, or you may have to extend your downwind a little farther out. So, of course, this is our responsibility as pilots at non-tired airports, but when you're flying to Trenton, for example, the controller there will take care of that for you. So just want to wrap this up with recommendations that, again, come directly from that airplane flying handbook, which should be your main reference for this stuff here. So just kind of quickly read through these. So the first one is tune and verify radio frequencies before entering the airport traffic area. So please make sure if you're flying into Princeton that you're talking on 12272 and not you're still not on Solberg or anything, right? So just want to make sure on the right frequency. And if you are inbound, try to report your position 10 miles out and keep listening for reports from other inbound traffic, right? You do not want your first call to be Princeton traffic, 8 Mike Charlie's over the field at 2000. And the next thing, again, is just emphasizing all those radio calls we were talking about earlier, right? You want to make sure you're reporting when you're entering downwind, turning downwind to base, and base to final. And these ones in bold, I think, are the most important for what we're talking about right now, right? Again, just like we mentioned earlier, you should be at the traffic pattern altitude before you enter the pattern. You don't want to end up descending into it. Always want to be scanning for the aircraft in the pattern, and you just want to make sure you're on the correct CTAF frequency. And another thing we don't see too often anymore, but still important, is you should be aware there are aircraft in the pattern without radios, right? For example, someone may have an electrical failure, they don't have radios, so you want to make sure you are, again, scanning for other traffic. So let's say, for example, you're holding short of 28, just because you are listening to the frequency, you don't hear anybody, doesn't mean you can just automatically assume you can head on that runway. Definitely want to angle yourself a little bit to the right, just check on final, make sure no one's there in case they're not on radios. And then the last recommendation from the FAA is use exterior lights to improve the chances of being seen, especially, of course, at nighttime there. So yeah, that pretty much wraps up the discussion with traffic patterns over there. So if you guys have any questions, we can start adding that into the chat, and I'll start answering those. All right, so I've got one from Anita here. Is there a recommended departure procedure for 39N runway 28? So Anita, could you be just a little bit more specific with that? I'm not sure if you mean like departing to the practice area or elsewhere. All right, so from Joe, any recommendations for interacting with the helicopter? So that's a good question too, right? So first of all, I want to remember that helicopters are on the right pattern. So if you are, practicing traffic patterns, if there's a helicopter also in the pattern, just want to remember they're going to be on the opposite side of the runway. So you do want to be scanning for traffic over there. And again, if there's anything you're unsure about, just communicate with them directly over their frequency and they'll respond right back, right? As again, they are a little bit different than fixed wing, can have a little bit more maneuverability. So I think just being able to communicate with them is a big thing there. Let's see. So Enval asked, when inbound, what's the minimum distance should we aim to be at the traffic pattern altitude? So you want to be at the traffic pattern altitude when you're on the 45. So it kind of depends, again, where we're coming from, right? If we're on 28 and you're coming from the practice area north, you're crossing over the field at 2000. Once you're clear of the pattern, then you start that descent into the traffic pattern on the 45. But yeah, the general rule, just want to make sure before you're on the 45, you're at the traffic pattern altitude. Okay, Anita, I got your question there, yeah. So if we do take a look at the airport remarks on the chart supplements for Princeton, yeah, I think this is what you're mentioning here. For 28, we shouldn't be turning before we reach 900 feet and crossing Cherry Hill Road. All right, Garrett asks, should we self-announce crossing the runway above traffic pattern when coming in from the north? I'm going to say, yeah, that's something I do. That's something I tell all my students to do. I hear a lot of people do that as well. Again, we're just trying to increase our level of safety. They're providing an additional radio call to telling people, hey, we're above that runway. And what I would also do, in addition to saying we're crossing midfield at 2000, kind of give a little extra there. I would say maneuvering to join the 45 into the left downwind for 28, just so that people know what you're about to do. Because a lot of times people will say crossing midfield 2000, but they might just be like transitioning the area from north to south. So I think just kind of adding that extra information of, all right, we're about to join that 45 is helpful there. All right, so I'm not seeing, oh, here we go. So Bill says, what about calls from 5 or 10 miles out? So FAA recommends you want to make that first call 10 miles out. They don't have a recommendation for 5 miles out, but that's something that we should be practicing as well, right? So I'll call 10 miles, I'll also call maybe somewhere between 3 to 5 as well, just again, especially if there's other traffic in the area. But yeah, the FAA just recommends the 10, but definitely a little extra if there's other traffic. All right, cool. So I'm not seeing any other questions filtering in here. So I think that pretty much will wrap up our lesson there for, oh, okay, we got one more here actually. So from Garrett, if the traffic pattern is busy for spacing, I see some do S-turns while on downwind. Acceptable. I probably wouldn't do S-turns on downwind, right? Just, again, if anybody is joining the 45, don't want to end up cutting into them, but the recommended thing we do is just do like a right 360 or a 360 in the opposite direction of the airport to create spacing. So I wouldn't do S-turns. I would do 360s instead. Just, again, S-turns may cut a little close to other people in the pattern as well. 360 is a better idea. All right, cool. So I think I'm not seeing anything else coming over there. So yeah, that'll kind of just wrap up our lessons there. So hopefully that was useful for you guys. I know you probably know most of the stuff already, most of you, but again, hopefully it's just a good refresher on some important topics there with our flying there. So let me see, does Gab want to say anything here? Yeah, okay.
Thank you everybody for coming. Does anyone have any ideas, suggestions, questions for future Zoom meetings? Wesley, you did amazing.
Thank you, appreciate it.
That slideshow was so impressive.
Oh, thanks. Yeah, I was kind of trying to make it like Princeton centered, so it'd be helpful to you guys. So that's good.
You've got like Brett over here with the applause. No, that was
nice. Thank you.
That was above standard, I would say.
Thank you.
But if there are seriously any ideas or questions for future Zoom meetings, classes, maybe with Wesley again because he was so great, feel free to jump out, speak, say something right now, or you can write in the chat.
That was great, Wesley. Thanks a lot.
Thanks so much. Appreciate it. Thanks for listening.
Yeah, and a suggestion, Gabrielle, maybe, I mean, communication is always difficult. Like just a Zoom class testing communication language, like, you know, like what are the typical mistakes that like pilots make, what standard phraseology, what to say, what not to say, and quite frankly, what you may hear in certain situations that are different, let's say at Princeton, maybe Trenton, whatever.
Yeah, I was going to ask the same thing, especially comparing Trenton to Princeton would be great, Wesley.
Yeah.
All right, great. I wrote those notes down. Did that inspire any other ideas from anyone? All right, I'll let you keep thinking about that. And if you have suggestions, feel free to give the airport a call, email us in. These sessions are super helpful for students, pilots, and the questions obviously come from you. And if you have the question, somebody else probably has the question. So don't be shy. And that's all I got. Anything else you want to say, Wesley?
I think you've covered it all. Yeah, I just want to thank everybody for tuning in and listening and paying attention, and appreciate the active participation as well.